Hello. I want to keep this short because you have a lot of work to do this week. I know in your life, but also in this class. But I wanted to make this short introductory video because I've got some good news and some bad news. The bad news is about our meeting on campus as a class or as a divided class because that's not going to happen for another couple weeks. I just got a one-sentence email from the administration wanting to wait until the third week of February before we can start meeting on campus and start forming our learning community. And I'm not happy about that because the reason I wanted to teach hybrid classes is so that we could have in-person communities. To have a wide-ranging exploration of American literature, and the pandemic is not helping us do that. I also won't be having class meetings on team over these next couple weeks as we wait to go back on campus, and that's simply because I am very frustrated with myself. Using teams to try to form a kind of community. I haven't figured out how to do that effectively. So instead, as an alternative to that, I'm going to be setting up one-on-one appointments to meet with as many of you as can make it kind of throughout the week in times we would normally either have class or I would have office hours, or to work into your schedule. So I'll be sending an email out to you guys just with times. And if any time slot works for you, we could sit almost together, virtually together, and talk about the stuff we've been reading, any questions you have in particular that maybe you don't want to share with the group. And also start talking about your paper. This is something I would do anyway. I would encourage us to get together either before or after class or during office hours when you start working on your paper, just so we can touch base, even if it's just for a few minutes to see how that's going. Because I want this first paper to be the best thing you've ever written, frankly. So the bad news is we can't do the hybrid part of this class yet in a way that I think it's set up to do, which is have individual instruction online, but also have that experience of in-person learning. It's not going to happen for another couple weeks, so that's really bad news for me. Maybe it's fine news for you. The good news is you have 3 amazing stories to read this week. This might be my favorite collection of stories. They're not easy to read because it's pretty depressing stuff. I wish I could I wish I could go through this and find the stories with all the happy endings. But they're not, I don't think those stories, not many of them exist. Because literature often focuses on conflict, and conflict usually doesn't come out great in the end, at least in the kind of masterpieces of literature, the things that have resonated over the generations. But it is interesting and it is important. So I hope you spend some time, you block off some time to really read and think about these 3 stories. Last week, we were kind of focused on immigrant voices, right? The experiences of the kind of racial or national other trying to fit into this larger kind of dominant culture of America in the 19th century. And this week is a bit similar to that because it's really focusing on female voices in the 1800s, a kind of gendered other, I guess, and for most of these stories, kind of a racial other again. The first story, I just want to kind of touch on each one briefly. The first story is Kate Chopin's masterpiece, maybe at least in terms of her short stories, a story called Desiree's Baby, and I'm not gonna spoil the ending. It's another one of those with a surprise ending, but it's about a woman who has a sense of herself, has been defined a certain way by the society she's in, and then Thanos snap almost. 1 second later, she's defined completely different. She sees herself completely differently, and can't deal with that new sense of herself, that new social definition of herself, because she's internalized the racism, the gendered racism, especially of the time. So it's a heck of a story. It's set. Kate Chopin wrote it at the end of the 1800s, but it's set in the time right before the Civil War. So that's important to recognize kind of the situation. It's set on a Louisiana plantation. So, and it's also an example of regionalism, right? Which is one of those kind of branches of realism, right? It's, let me talk about a certain region of the country and the kind of unusual society, the unusual language, the unusual social structures of that place. And we get a little bit of that regionalism in Desiree's Baby. The second story is by Charles Chestnut, North Carolina's own Charles Chestnut, an important African-American writer, writing at the turn of the century, from the 1800s into the 1900s. And the story's The Wife of His Youth, which is another really interesting story. And it actually does kind of have a happy ending. And it focuses on the African-American middle class, the kind of upwardly mobile African-Americans who are part of the early part of the Great Migration, where many African-Americans left the rural South starting in the late 1800s and on into the early decades of the 20th century, to escape the Jim Crow South, to escape the racial vigilantes, the white supremacist terrorists that were all through the South after Reconstruction, and they were just like, I'm out, why stick around, and moved up to the urban centers of the North. This is one of those stories set in Cleveland, and it's about this group called the Blue Vein Society, of kind of middle class, upper middle class African Americans, and the in-betweenness that they feel in society. And so it's an exploration of colorism, maybe the first one I know of in American literature, or at least an early one, maybe not the earliest. So it's interesting in that. And it also poses a really interesting moral question, again, of how the protagonist is going to define himself as a good man or not, right? And sometimes, like, what he's able to do legally isn't the same thing as what he can do morally. So it's a fascinating little short story. And after that, I've included a video that's connected to another Charles Chestnut story, something we're not reading. It's a novel called The Morrow of Tradition. And it's essentially about, it's set in North Carolina, and it's about the Wilmington Massacre of 1898. And the reason I included that is not because you'll have to take a test on it or be quizzed on it or write a paper about it. But it's an important part of American history, and specifically North Carolina history, that I knew nothing about until I lived in North Carolina. And it wasn't until probably graduate school that I even had ever heard of it. And that's frustrating. It's frustrating to think that there are things we don't know about our own country's history. Many, many things, obviously. But things that are purposefully covered up. This isn't like conspiracy theory. This happened, and over the generations, people didn't... It became invisible, much like Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. It was silenced. This little part of our country's narrative was covered up. It was a cover-up. And it came back into kind of... There was some commentary about it earlier this month when the armed insurrection at the Capitol in D.C. occurred, because some people who know their history said there's only been one successful armed insurrection in the United States, an overthrow of a democratically elected government, and that was in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. So I included this little video, even though it may not have to do with literature, it may not have to do with story, but it certainly has to do with history. And it's important to realize that the folks like Charles Chestnut that are writing at this time are living with that as part of their history. So it's worth a few minutes of your time. And if you know all about it, you probably, heck, if you grew up in North Carolina, you may know more about it than I do. I'm still catching up with these blank spaces in my own education. But if you haven't dug into that at all, this is a really interesting little video to catch you up the way it helped catch me up. The final story is probably the best known in this set, and it's called The Yellow Wallpaper, and it's an example of psychological realism, and maybe the first great short story in American literature that really is about psychology. It's inside the head of a woman who's losing her mind. And again, it's a woman who's struggling because she's being defined by authority figures as this one thing, even though that definition, that confinement, both literal and metaphorical, is slowly driving her crazy. So it's a famous short story, and I think rightfully so. Again, there's not a lot of laughs, but it's important, right? And this whole focus on the experience of the other, in this case the gendered other, I think is worth our attention for sure. Okay, the last thing I'm asking you to do is to get back to your paper and write up the introduction for it. So you can turn that in. I can see kind of what direction you're heading, look at your thesis statement. Hopefully, and then over the next couple of weeks, we can get together one-on-one and talk about it. Anyway, that's all I've got. If you've got any questions, shoot me an email, shoot me a text on Teams. Hopefully, we'll be talking soon. Hopefully, pandemic and the administration willing, we'll actually get to see each other in a couple weeks. And I'm looking forward to that. All right. Work hard. Be kind. I'll see you one way or another pretty soon. Bye-bye.